can you please state your name and your date of birth?
Oh, my name is Roger Edmund Webster, and my date of birth is 1941, and my so-so recollection is 3:45 in the morning. But I lost my birth certificate because I went to the trouble of getting a second one just so I could gather that sensation of origin. My first memory of Venice is my aunt, whose name was Nellie. And every time we took her home, there was no 10 freeway, of course. So you took the straight streets and then you zigged down. She wouldn't take us to where she lived. She would take us to a bench on the boardwalk. That was her home. And it wasn't for lack of money. It's just the orientation and the touching the world without being invited and just sitting in a world orientation. And I felt it the minute I came to Venice. So I was enjoying my neighborhoods and enjoying the life in that period of time in Los Angeles. I had lovely parents, but I was somehow signaled to be somewhere else. And I didn't know if I had some uncomfort, but I was born with a happy, sad face. And that's kind of how every minute of my life is. Venice was in slow motion. That was danger mixed with surfy. It was a good place to incubate the person that I am. It sort of, by not being something too much and being something that wasn't characteristic everywhere you went. There would always be enclaves, like Laurel Canyon had enclaves, but it was also very rock and roll and howdy doody, jive. And because Venice wasn't the place for East Coast universities. It was a place that not everybody went there because they were running away, but there's a certain implication when you get drawn to Venice that you're protecting yourself from some icky feeling that you feel in your normal world. And this strange shift somehow is a way to lose that feeling. And it's almost like you're starting over. There was people doing pranks, there was fighting, there was sexiness galore, and there was the water and the surfing vibe. And there was that period of time which had its own thing. So I hadn't really been to Venice, except I went to the peninsula during my high school years, 54 to 58, thinking that maybe I could buy property there. Because I started thinking about property first when I was very young, because I wanted a ranch, because residential neighborhoods weren't ranches, and they didn't have that feeling of expansive discovery. I was in art school for a while at Chenard, and one of the things we did as students and artist type people is to look for studios and find them at a price we could afford. I had gotten a studio with David Greenberg, who was interestingly part of the family who created Standard Brands paints. David was at Tempe, Arizona, with a guy named Ted Tanaka and a few other people, and he wanted to get a studio with me, and then he would go back to school for a semester, and then he'd come back and join me, and we'd probably live in the studio together. I lived in the studio for years and years on where Animal House is on the 66 and 62 and 66 and a half. We had the whole thing. Well, we were super buff on Venice. I mean, it was like a theater piece. It was like a Broadway musical. Everything you could possibly want it to be, it was. And that's because it wasn't like everywhere else. And then the artists were all tucked into unusual spaces. Sometimes one guy's in the place where they used to store the trams, and but he's in there putting up drywall, putting up a loft, putting down a very interesting collectible rug. Navajo rugs were even big way back then. Tony Berlant, one of the local artists who supposedly found diamonds when he was tearing a wall apart over on 2nd Street in Santa Monica, found a sack of diamonds. I never verified that. Well, I was surfing, I was wicked, I was transitional, and my style was a little bit hobo-ish and a little bit of army clothes and a little bit of, this and that. And I had a whole rack of girl clothes in my in my bedroom, and when girls came to visit me, I could always play with them and dress them up or something, or they would want to get dressed up. And I was getting a lot of my clothes in this most exciting way. I would always walk up and down Windward, sometimes with the wetsuits. I started surfing before I used a wetsuit. And I would go back to the office, and we'd do art or photography things there, or do editing and developing some of our products. Or I would take my clothes up to the room. My arms would be aching. You could get truly miraculous vintage clothing, male and female. I took about 80% female and about 20% male. And I called it the Venice Free Giveaway, but it was one of the local churches that might still be around. And they brought a truck down with those big cardboard barrels, and they just pushed it off into these big piles. And there were not a lot of people there. There was not a lot of competition. So everything about Venice was like strangely amazing. If you had gotten there a little bit earlier, and I had been down there taking photographs before I moved, and they still had the trolleys. So I don't know what date they stopped the trolleys. And I took a picture of a guy named Eby, who I didn't know, but I met later. He was one of the surfer radicals, kind of little bad boys. And he was on a skateboard hanging onto the back of one of the trolleys with this little canopy of canvas and fringe and little dolphins and stuff painted. It was that Ocean Park vibe. And of course, I was trying to hit on what happened in Santa Monica when they took out that other section of this amazing housing where people could have gotten old and passed away without being shuffled off somewhere on the basis that they would be able to afford to be in the Twin Towers. And so the Twin Towers, got built, and the Sea Colony condos got built. It's not very hurtful to the environment, and there's some amenities there. But it was also kind of the death of Main Street on the normal level, because those people, there was nowhere else to go shopping. It was perfect. They had the beach, and they had a series of stores and services. Anyhow, it's amazing that I didn't wait too long to buy a building either. Like, I bought a building. Now, I wouldn't buy it from the artists themselves, but I bought a building from like a business manager who was involved in that, and they owned it. And then I got a little tired of their own selves, and I bought a building on Westminster, and that had Peter Alexander and I think Guy Dill, not Laddie Dill. I'm friends with both of them, but and Jim Ganzer. We started a company eventually called Environmental Communications. So we were always documenting architecture, environment, social behavior, and ecology. We had a series called The Ultimate Crisis. So because we were coming from the 60s, there was much more awareness about the planet and the circumstances. And people weren't talking about environment. They weren't talking about how the word environment unifies everything instead of separating it. And environmental communications was in its heyday between 1969 and 70, kind of the startup, and about 80, and tapered off between 80 and 83. Anyways, the environment in Venice was characterized by a guy named Raynard Banham, and he called, his book was called The Four Ecologies of Los Angeles. And one of his things that he highlights is the arches, remaining arches, which sadly, I own one of those buildings. I used to own the hotel with my first partner, Tom, which was called the St. Charles Hotel. And that's the one at the very end of Windward. But that was an annex to the St. Mark's, which was right on the boardwalk where all those little stalls are for selling things. And if you went back to our other building, which is the flea market building, which is the south northeast corner with white arches, that was Security Pacific Bank at one time. It was 2.5 stories. And there was an earthquake in Long Beach in about 35 or 38 or 33. I haven't been thinking about that for a long time. But that caused a lot of people to have to tear things down. And after having been through the earthquake and other things, the people who had invested in Venice, eventually they start the marina. And everybody goes, oh, our property's going to go up in value. We own on the Circle, we own the, actually, it's the site of the original Venice bathhouse. And that was a big building with no interior, just a giant swimming pool and gorgeous, massive windows. There's a copy of it on the boardwalk, which copies just a few aspects of it, not the super grandeur of it. And that was right on the edge of the water. And the water had like a roller coaster of some kind in it. And we owned the building. We used to own Hama Sushi, which I forget what Hama Sushi was beyond. We never looked back far enough, but we bought the lot next door, and that was the Venice News. It was a little skinny building with a curved front, you know, and columns and a portico up at the top. But when you bought a property in those days, like at one point, I think we bought 5 properties, or 4, or 1 and then 4 more, that were all pretty near the lagoon. And of course, that filled our hearts with joy, what we were doing, you know. When I used to drive down Pacific Avenue, there was a big Morton Bay fig tree that we all got arrested for trying to save, because if they didn't cut it down, they could build 1 less condo. They could build 7 condos, or they could build 6 condos. And we started a little fire on the corner. My partner was up in the tree protesting. My partner, Tom Sewell, was up in the tree protesting in a tuxedo. And he's a very sort of handsomey, theatrical looking person. So it was just fabulous. There was 2 other guys. One's a very talented artist who's still around, the Thunberg brothers, who was hugging the trees when the cops came. That's the first time I saw them beat somebody's forearms with a billy club and then spray them with mace and watch them crumble on the ground. The leaving of Venice as a place, having a studio and eating wherever you eat, or buying food or cooking it, whatever you were doing, it started to disappear as the culture of younger people started going to restaurants. And it's a really interesting cultural phenomenon. And it's, you know, things changed when the 10 freeway went in too. But as much as it changed, they went in Santa Monica and they tore down an entire neighborhood. It's not entirely Jewish, but just like, Venice, first block of the beach, and sometimes even thicker with more multi-unit, wonderful old wood buildings and things like blah, blah, blah. And they tore all that down on the presumption that they were gonna fix Santa Monica. And Main Street had been sort of doggy a little, although it had many heydays in the past. But it took, things related to computer-related businesses, whether it was maybe, I don't think Netflix was down there, but everybody was starting to filter down there, and a lot of young were starting to filter down there as a result. So there was a whole new, I think it was called basically the .com generation, and they were gobbling up artist space, and artist space started disappearing. And there's been several waves since. Now Netflix was one of the new ones, and I rent to Google with my partner, and they took our parking lot, which was fairly big, but our building is a really lovely old building behind the Rose Cafe, and they wanted it for a park for their people, and they had buildings on both sides of the street. All this property was once part of the gas company. So our building is called the gas company. It's a 2-story brick building with a loading dock and has a really cool feeling. But they sold it to us separately because the Venice people were so fucking crazy about stopping things that they stopped this project with Frank Gehry and this wonderful building in the back, and they were gonna have a sculpture garden in the middle, and the most prestigious symphony orchestra had signed up to be part of it. And, but it would have been considered elite, is I think one of the problems. So they just bust people in, which shouldn't be legal, and they stopped it. They stopped a lot of things. They definitely stopped the Venice canals, which they would have gone to 70 feet, and they were going to open up the main channel, because the canal goes right up to the main channel and then goes under through a tube. I'm more interested in the tourists than I am the locals. When the tourists walk around, I say hi. I engage them. I'll let them take pictures with me. I'll do what I can. Some people call me like the mayor of Venice because my presence seems to be more based on humanity than business. So I tell people I'm not in the real estate business. I just love buildings. Venice is an opportunity for almost anything you might want. You have to get along with it. And you have to say, I'm satisfied and I want to stay. And you have to feel proud and you have to be pissed off. The Shadow of Your Smile is a song my father wrote. He won an Academy Award for it. Venice has a smiling shadow.
What do you mean by that?
The words explain it. It's your job to feel it. It seeps into you. And every time you meet a person who has wealth but has anger and is spiteful and difficult, they're trying to tell you the magic thing that they started to realize somewhat before they die, but they can't tell you because they're not 100% sure. So they become a character. Now, that's what's happening to me.
So
And Venice will do that to you. You might come down here, a joy boy with a few pixels in your pocket, and you won't leave the same. And everybody says Venice is gone, but Venice will be here after we're gone.